microphone, but it's not here yet, so we'll try our best until it arrives. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. So far.
Okay. If you can't, just raise your hand and I'll try to raise up my treble in my throat. Last year, fall, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the death of Father Augustus Tolton's mother, Martha Jane Chisley Tolton, we held a fundraiser banquet for the cause of Father Augustus Tolton. And to make as a centerpiece that gathering of Catholics from all over the Archdiocese and some other places who surrounded us in the efforts for trying to proclaim Father Tolton a saint, we thought we'd give out one citation or one award to a woman who in her own life emulated the virtues of this courageous woman who made a daunting escape out of slavery in northeastern Missouri and made her way to about 46 miles, hiding in the night with 3 children, a babe in arms by the name of Anne, and 2 sons, Charles and Augustus. Her husband had already left to fight on the Union side of the Civil War. Somewhere, somebody said that there were some benefits for blacks who fought on the Union side. Some blacks were able to fight, others were not. As soon as the men were conscripted, the government was very, very slow to really incorporate them into the Union cause. Many of them never saw battle. Many of them were doing menial labor, setting railroad ties and bringing supplies to the other white troops and so forth. Her husband left in about 1860 to fight on the Union side, but he ended up dying in a hospital in St. Louis. It was never clear what benefits there were for black men to enroll in the Civil War. And much of it probably was more false than it was actually true. But Martha Jane would not find out until about 7 years later that her husband had actually died. She saw his name on a list of Civil War casualties. And by that time, she was already into freedom. 46 miles, traveling to Hannibal, Missouri, the home of Mark Twain, where she connected with some sympathizers. And then she was apprehended by Confederate troops. Later on, Augustus Tolton mentioned that there were $200 bounty on each of their heads. But practically like a miracle, Union troops had descended upon the scene and reminded the Confederates that they were standing on Union ground. Then they took Martha Jane and her 3 children to the shores of the Mississippi and told her she would have to make it on her own. She had never rowed a boat in her life, but suddenly there appeared a dilapidated rowboat with 1 oar. And she put her children in it and made it across the Mississippi with Confederates shooting at her. She made it to the other side, to Quincy, Illinois, which was the station of the Underground Railroad. On the award that we give an African-American woman who emulates the virtues of Martha Jane Tolton, we picture that boat with the 1 oar. And we give it to a woman who emulates her virtues and with respect to her children, perhaps even her grandchildren. Then we give her a check for $1,000.
All right.
And it was well received. We'll do it again in October, on October 19th. We're still searching for a woman for the second time around. It is perhaps the stuff of movie making, but it is in fact a rather daring escape. We don't know what sponsored her to make such an escape, because there were severe consequences for recaptured slaves. Sometimes an ear was cut off, maybe even a foot. Sometimes a severe beating with salt and vinegar poured into someone's wounds. A woman could be raped, her children taken away from her, family broken up or divided or whatever. The consequences were rather severe. The state of Missouri was a rather ambivalent state with regards to slavery. Part of it was pro-slavery, part of it was anti-slavery. But the northeast section, bordering on the Mississippi River and the state of Illinois, was pro-slavery. Mostly farms, tobacco, wheat, rice, and corn. And slave owners from southern states were enticed to come to Missouri because the slave trade was rather lucrative. Peter Paul Tolton and Martha Jane Chisley were owned by separate families. They were owned by Catholic families. And Peter Paul Tolton met Martha in a field when she was cradling a child, a slave child, who had collapsed in the field, and she screamed out for help. And Peter Paul Tolton was rather inspired by the woman who was cradling this child, and they developed a relationship therefrom, and they obtained permission from their respective families for their marriage. And the church where they were married is still standing. If you go to Brush Creek, Missouri today, the church there still stands where they were married and then where the children were baptized, and then there's a cemetery on either side of the church. There's the cemetery for the common citizenry, the other farmers in the area, which is next to the farm that the Toltons labored as slaves. In fact, the farm where the Toltons lived has only had 3 owners in all these many years. On the other side of the church is the slave cemetery. There's about 80 people buried there. But there are no markers, there are no names, because in those days, slaves were non-persons, so to speak. What inspired Martha Jane for this heroic escape, which would set at least one of her children on the path to greatness? We don't know. Being without a protective man, he was gone, she didn't know if he was going to ever come back, probably made her very, very nervous. We do have some information that there were slave traders moving in the area at the time in which the Civil War broke out. And slave traders usually meant that they were looking rather intently at families which stood the chance of being broken up. Children separated from their parents, parents or spouses separated from each other, and so forth. But the escape had to be absolutely successful by reason of, again, the consequences that would come to fore if she was caught. But God intervened, we believe, and brought her to the other side. She raised her kids in Quincy. Quincy, like many other places, was a mixed experience. You had the Underground Railroad individuals, some prominent citizens who received slaves and helped them escape and get as even far as Canada. Then you had the other side of Quincy, which wanted to keep everything status quo. And that meant that the races had to be socially separated. So we're talking about the context of Tolton and his proposed sainthood within this backdrop of many social deficits that were taken for granted at that time in the 19th century. The first school that Martha Jane put her children in, St. Boniface, the church is still there today, the parents of the children kind of rose up and convinced the pastor that Augustus told them how to get out of the school. They did not tolerate their children attending a school where there was a black child. So Augustus was left in tears on several occasions until an Irish priest came along by the name of Peter McGurk from the Irish parish down the street of St. Lawrence O'Toole, who received the family into the parish and dared his parishioners to say anything about it. Today in Quincy, if you visit St. Peter Parish, there is a marble statue in front of the school in Tolton's likeness. And they have the honor of celebrating Tolton as their first parishioner or their first citizen to this day. There's also several places of the Underground Railroad to visit in Quincy. Places of people who were arraigned for hiding slaves, who usually would make it to certain houses in the middle of the night until they were caught, for which there was usually either heavy fines or heavy imprisonment. Tolton was a gifted young man who attached himself to the church, and he was tutored by a group of Notre Dame sisters who taught him German and the subjects, reading, writing, and arithmetic during the months when he could not work. He worked in a leather factory and a horse saddle making factory at another period, and a bottling factory still at another period of his life, along with his mother. He learned how to speak German. He was taught Italian, and he became an altar boy and soon discovered an attraction to the priesthood. But in the 19th century, there were certain laws in certain states that said institutions could not mix the races. So your major social and religious institutions made sure that there was no presence of black people in their spaces. Otherwise, there were consequences. And this co-opted the churches in many respects, both Protestant as well as Catholic. Therefore, it was impossible to find a seminary for Tolton here in the United States in the 19th century. Over the course of some 7 years, the priests who tutored him in Quincy wrote to different places, and some places didn't give them a response, or others finally gave them a response saying, no, we cannot take a black candidate. But the Franciscan fathers of the Sacred Heart province had a superior general who knew the prefect of the Propaganda Fide. The Propaganda Fide is the dicastery of the Vatican that oversees our missions in developing countries or third world countries. And they run a seminary where they take students from these developing countries and train them in order to send them back to their country in order to serve as priests. The Urban College exists to this day. I was there just 2 weeks ago to look into the archives to get some material on Tolton from their records. So the Cardinal Prefect received Tolton, and he left here in 1880 and spent 6 years there to study philosophy and theology. And we were able to obtain several copies of his class roster, which showed students from literally all over the world, from different countries. He was one of just 2 Americans who were sent there. When Tolton went there, when he left here, he figured that he probably would never see his family again. He figured that, or it was told him, that once he was ordained, he would be sent to Africa because it was considered that he could not possibly succeed under the racial apartheid of the United States of America, seeing that there were no other black priests known in the country and the laws that were emerging in this country that kept the races separate. Until the night before he was ordained a priest, which was the night of April 23rd, 1886. The Cardinal Prefect of the Propaganda, Octavio Simeone, told Tolton that he was changing the decision of sending him to Africa. Up to that time, Tolton had mastered some of the African dialects in addition to Italian. And he was set consciously to pack his bags the day after his ordination and go some country in Africa, probably Borneo at that time. The cardinals told him, you know, the United States considers itself to be the most enlightened nation on the face of the earth.
Considers operative.
Right. If that is true, they should be able to receive a black priest. So we've changed our minds. We're going to send you back home. Tolton immediately became rather distraught because it was a sudden and quick change over which he had no influence. But having taken his propaganda oath, namely to serve under the umbrella of the propaganda agency and to report back periodically on the progress of his ministry, he accepted it and came back on June 3rd of 1886 and said his first Mass in the parish that kicked him out of the school, St. Boniface. He labored in Quincy for about 3 years. One of the witnesses that the ecclesiastical court has interviewed for the cause is a man who just died recently, whose father used to slip into Tolton's church to hear his sermons. He was supposed to be going to the German church, St. Boniface, but he would slip out the side door of the church and go down the hill to St. Joseph's church, which was the Negro church, where Tolton was offering Mass and preaching. And he would thereby get into trouble. Tolton worked in Quincy for about 3 years. There were many whites who came to his church and contributed to his church, as well as listening to his sermons and receiving his ministrations. That stirred up some controversy in Old Quincy on the part of Catholic as well as Protestant clergy and some other people. One particular priest reported him to the bishop, and Tolton was accused of creating a social situation which was unacceptable. And that was the unusual thing of mixing the races. So Tolton was told he either had to restrict his ministry to black people or otherwise get out of town. But that didn't stop the white people who were coming to his church until certain of the clergy began stepping up their comments as well as their threats. And then Tolton was called into the bishop's office again, and he was told to leave. At that time, Chicago had a fledgling group of black Catholics that were worshiping downtown in the basement of St. Mary's Church, which is today called Old St. Mary's. And the Archbishop at that time was an Irishman by the name of Patrick Fian. He was originally from Nashville. The picture of Tolton that you have on the leaflets was taken in 1890 when Archbishop Fian celebrated his 20th anniversary of being a bishop. Every priest in Chicago had his photograph taken for a Jubilee book. And that is the picture of Tolton that appeared in that Jubilee book in 1890. Patrick Fian invited Tolton to come to Chicago, but Tolton had to get permission from Rome to do so. And there were letters sent back and forth in the Italian language. Whenever Tolton wrote Rome, he always wrote in Italian, because nobody over there speaks English. And they finally gave him permission to come to Chicago. So he left 2 weeks before Christmas in 1889, leaving his mother and his sister behind. He said he would send for them once he got settled. And he did that about 8, 9 months thereafter. He was put up in some small apartment in South Indiana Street in Chicago And then the Archbishop made him the pastor of all black Catholics that were in Chicago at the time. It was a motley group of them at the time. Many of them were former slaves, free slaves. Some of them were refugees. It was on the south side of Chicago, the tenement housing in the poor neighborhoods. It was not the nicest place to live in the city. In fact, to this day, scouring the historical records of the city of Chicago, there are no photographs of the South Side. No one wanted to picture Chicago's South Side. It was a slum with a capital S. And that's where we lived, and that is where Tolton worked. Tolton decided that if his ministry was going to have any credibility, he needed more than just a storefront for black Catholics. So he began raising funds from sympathetic whites to build a church. An Irish woman by the name of Anne O'Neill offered him $10,000 if the bishop would also offer $10,000. And he wrote to Catherine Drexel. Now, St. Catherine Drexel, you remember the wealthy Philadelphia heiress who spent her life trying to build some semblance of a Catholic church for Native Americans and African Americans. She gave him in several payments the sum of $36,000, which under 19th century currency values probably was somewhere in the vicinity of about $300,000. And he built, at least he started building a church on 36th and Dearborn Street on the south side, and they worshiped in that first level for a number of years, at least until Tolton's death. We have no information regarding Tolton's health at the time. By the time he arrived in Chicago, he was emotionally drained and very, very fearful. The Ku Klux Klan was beginning to emerge, and the Ku Klux Klan targeted several entities for much of their hate-mongered campaign. Jews, Roman Catholics, and blacks. The 19th century, after emancipation, as you know from history, blacks began emerging into the political process of this country. There were men entering Congress. Some of them were local magistrates of some sort or another. The Ku Klux Klan worked a campaign to pull those men out of office, literally, not by re-election, but by threats and vigilante justice and lynchings and that sort of thing. And Tolton, as it is revealed in some of his letters, he feared that he might be a victim of that kind of racist violence that was already emerging in the 19th century. Being a priest, a black man with a Roman collar around his neck was an anomaly for the white community and a news sensation for the black community. So he was a double target for racist violence at his time. He was the only one. If you can imagine him and his own consciousness being the only one without anyone to lean on to or to somehow derive some sense of strength or courage to withstand the social deficits of that time, which eventuated with him being the only one of his time, and there was no one else out there. It was an emotional burden for him. Of course, health-wise, most hospitals did not treat blacks. If you could find a doctor who would sneak into the night and come to minister to you, you were lucky. Most blacks created their own remedies in the kitchen for this ailment or that ailment. But tuberculosis ran rather rampant in the 19th century, for which there was hardly any treatment. There were no antibiotics or anything of that nature. In 1897, the first week of July, Chicago suffered an intense heat wave of sustained temperatures in advance of 100 degrees to 110 degrees, for which there were about 60-some people who died in the city, including 2 priests. And one of them was Toten. He was coming back from a retreat, a spiritual retreat for priests in Bourbonnais, Illinois, and got off a train at 35th Street and walked several blocks, and he collapsed on the street. A couple people called out for the constables walking the neighborhood, and they somehow managed to get him in a horse-driven carriage to a nearby Mercy hospital ran by the RSMs, the Mercy Sisters, who graciously received him, even though that hospital did not treat black people at the time. And they worked on him for about 6-7 hours until he expired about 8:30 in the evening. The diagnosis was heat stroke complicated by uremia. Uremia is kind of a backup of poisonings in the system. He requested to be buried in Quincy, and he's buried there today off the main street, St. Peter's Cemetery, off of Broadway Street. Hopefully, next spring we'll probably open up his grave and to see what is there. I'll say some things about the process, and then I'll take your questions and your comments. Back in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI proclaimed a year for priests, a year whereby the Catholic world will reflect upon the gift of the priesthood, the Lord's priesthood, passed to men for the sanctification of his people, while we're waiting for him to come back to take us with him. And a lot of events went on across the United States in that year for priests. A lot of scholarly presentations, retreats, reflections, and celebrations of one sort or another. And then that culminated in a mass that the Pope had with priests from all over the world. So the largest gathering of priests known in Catholic history took place at the end of that year. For the Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Francis George, who was an oblate of Mary Immaculate, who worked in New Orleans and Mississippi in his younger priesthood days, decided to delve into the presbyterate of Chicago, the history of priesthood in Chicago, to find a priest whom he could raise up as someone who witnessed to the highest virtues of the priesthood that we know. And without challenge, the name that surfaced was Augustus Toten. And the cardinal announced, to the surprise of everyone, because no one had ever brought it forward before, he decided to ask Rome to consider Toten possibly for sainthood. That was in January of 2010. He surprised me by asking me to be the postulator for the cause. And that's what we've been doing ever since, these last couple of years. The process for looking into the possibility of sainthood for an individual is an arduous process. When the church names someone a saint, we're not giving them a merit badge or a trophy. It is the highest citation that the church can ever lay upon a human being. And it is essentially a declaration that the person is with God in the beatific vision. Now, given our infallible nature, we can't just simply make that declaration. The church asks for God's intervention to give endorsement to that declaration. And that is where an absolute miracle has to be demonstrated, a turnaround in health for which known medicine cannot explain. One miracle to be beatified, and a second one to be named a saint. And then if the person is named a saint, then their name can appear amongst the saints in our calendars, and a mass can be offered in their memory, and so forth. In order to arrive at that, there are several commissions that study a person's life. There's an historical commission and a theological commission, and then the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts, look into the situation. The historical commission is a collection of credentialed historians and archivists who pull together the historical record of a person's life. We have recent causes and we have historical causes. Recent causes are candidates for sainthood for whom witnesses are still living and breathing who knew of the person. Like an Archbishop Fulton Sheen, for example. There are many people around who knew of him, both friends and enemies. And then you have historical cases like Father Tolton's or André de Lille or Pierre Toussaint. These people are long dead, and anyone who knew of them are also long dead. That does not prevent the possibility of naming them saints, but it makes the process a little bit more challenging. Some people say, the deader you are, the better. Because of the passage of time, anyone who had anything against you usually subsides in history, and your enemies are also dead.
That's true.
In Tolton's situation, the priest who did him so badly there in Quincy, he's also dead. But they probably have reconciled in heaven by now. So the Historical Commission pulls together the archival record. We have received archival information from the Propaganda Fide in Rome. We have about almost 20 letters that Tolton wrote. Some of them in English, some of them in Italian, with different personages. The people that he most often wrote to were the Roman authorities of the Vatican, Catherine Drexel, and a Father John Slattery, who was a Josephite priest. We also have archival records from the Diocese of Springfield, which at the time of Tolton was the Diocese of Alton in Illinois. We have archival material. The letters principally come from the Blessed Sacrament Sisters in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. Archival information from the Franciscan Fathers, and probably the biggest portion of information is from newspaper articles that were written in Quincy and in Chicago. In the days in which there was no technology, there was no television, there was no telephone, any of that kind of thing. You got your information basically by newspapers. And the newspapers kind of followed Tolton. There were at least 5 different newspapers in Quincy, and there were at least 4 or 5 in Chicago. And almost like a diary, they kept track of Tolton, everything he said and everything that he did. And that perhaps enhances his cause in ways in which we could never have imagined, just those newspaper articles. So all that information has to be pulled together and documented with heavy footnotes for everything practically that is said about him. The next commission is a theological commission, which is designed to look at a person's writings or their speeches to make sure there is no heresy there. Tolton never wrote a book, and he never wrote down much because he was fearful of the Ku Klux Klan and other kinds of enemies who did not like black men giving speeches. He was largely an extemporaneous speaker, but we do have snippets, for example, from certain things that he said at least the first 3 Black Catholic Congresses, and some other comments that he made in his letters about certain things. That's the Theological Commission. The commission is designed to argue his virtues, the classic Catholic virtues, to make sure that he was a holy man connected to God in this life. His meekness, his obedience, his purity of life, his perseverance, his long-suffering, his charity, his faith, his hope, all of those things have to be argued by credentialed theologians. The third group is the ecclesiastical courts. Over the last months of the last year, we've been taking testimony from over 20 people across the United States who can give testimony in his historical case, because it's not a recent cause, about the sustained reputation of Tolton in the memory of the Catholic people. And that is where you come in. In other words, the church wants to make sure that Tolton is not an invention of last week or a figment of anyone's imagination. We have to demonstrate that he was well known and revered, if not prayed to, over the course of history since his death in 1897. That part of the cause worries me a great deal, because in the African American community, we don't seem to have a tradition of intercessory prayer with the saints. For some reason or another, it was not passed on to us in our catechesis. We've known of the Martin de Porres. We might have known of the Ugandan martyrs. We just found out about Josephine Bakita, another slave. But we don't have the cult of saints in our culture. And that worries me. Because saints are not proclaimed by the Pope or the bishops or the priests. Saints are made by people like yourselves. Rome wants to see that there is a groundswell, a proclamation of an individual whose life was holy and revered in our midst. Otherwise, it won't be done. So it comes from you. Somehow we have to get a hold of the cult of an Augustus Tolton. If we love the man, if we love what he endured and went through as an example for us in our trials in our present 21st century, if he is any sort of an example for us, we have to raise that up through his story. For which purpose we have given you a prayer of intercession, asking God to intervene in our lives because of this great man. In other words, he has to be more than a Frederick Douglass or a Daniel Rudd or a Martin Luther King. The church wants to see a connection that we have made with God with Tolton in between, endorsed by God's intervention, who responds to our prayer by granting us a miracle. That's how saints are made. Follow me?
Yes.
And that's why that prayer is God-awful important. We have to begin using it while we're spreading the Tolton story and hope that God will answer our prayers. Okay? How do you get a copy? Did you get one? You ran out. Once we end, you can come up to me. I'll get some more.
Don't look the website.
Oh yes, the website on the bulletin. There's a website there, www.toltoncanonization.org. That gives you the most recent and updated information about the progress of the cause and where we're going with it. Very attractive site. You can look it up anytime. Yes.
One with regard to the process of miracles performed when there was a martyr, taking the trouble to walk away.
No, when a person is a martyr, when they die because of hatred of faith, they don't need a miracle. Martyrdom.
And that's not that, but I wasn't sure.
And it's clear that someone has shed their blood for Christ for the faith. They don't need a miracle.
And the other thing to just toss out, there are a couple of military chaplains whose causes have been begun. And then next, Columbus are pretty active promoters, along with their own factions. I just wanted this to be a project for the next year.
It's already all a part of it, and on our website as well. All the protocols.
The Knights already know about the cause.
Yeah.
No, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise.
Sure.
Just their support.
Yes, sister.
Well, Brush Creek is in Missouri, and that's slave state, or was. And Harriet, the decision, the Dred Scott decision, and his wife are, they're in Missouri. The thing that we would, when we brought up the cult, well, I'm really not sure whether or not we can contribute, but I think that we should have some kind of contacts from the Archdiocese of St. Louis, because we go up there about twice a year
To Brush Creek.
to Brush Creek. And I'm wondering if we couldn't have a closer bond of relationship with the Chicago group. Because there's a group of descendants from the slave masters that are living in Old Monroe. And Gwen Krim has become, she used to serve on the staff of the Human Rights Office. And she has built up a great relationship with that group. And I think that there should be some way that we come together and work.
We do have connections with the Diocese of Jefferson City, where Brush
Yeah.
Creek is.
Right.
Because that's where the farm is, where the
Right.
Chiltons work, and the church.
But there aren't that many African Americans in Jefferson City. So, well, trying to have that relationship, and it would only come through somebody like yourself being appointed. And I was very much pleased with the fact that I learned that you would make the postulator. We would like to have
Make your sister go happy.
that would help you build up that cult
That's fine.
you were talking about.
We sponsor several pilgrimages a year to Brush Creek and Quincy. A big one is coming up in September. People from New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Maryland are coming together with Bishop Dominic Connor and Father Wickie Pacey from the Black and Indian Mission Collection. They're all descending upon Quincy and Chicago, visiting the farm where the Chiltons were raised, the church, cemeteries, and the place where he's buried, and up in Chicago where he worked. So we're looking forward to that. Yes?
What do you expect to find versus hope to find when you
That's what I want to know.
What do we hope to find when we open up this
expect
grave?
versus hope? I guess that bigger reason why
Well,
you
no, a lot depends on the condition of the soil, because people were not buried in vaults in those days. Where Tolton is buried, there's a little mound at St. Peter's Cemetery, and there's only 2 priests buried there. The priest who donated his grave to Tolton at the time, and he dug himself another grave himself on the other side. It varies. When we dig up people who are proposed for sainthood, it depends upon the condition of the soil, the condition of the body, and so forth and so on.
Are you looking for relics or like what?
Well, it's identification to make sure that the person is not fiction. And then to find out if they're incorrupt. Sometimes the body is not decomposed at all.
Nice interesting.
And then to find relics of the person. The Bishop of Springfield wants to reinter whatever we find there into the church that kicked him out, St. Boniface.
All right. Take him home. There you go. There you go.
Put him under the high altar.
Take them home.
Yes.
And I was visiting Dr. Martin. This wonderful saint.
The definitive biography written by Francis. Now deceased now about 6 years. From Slave to Priest, published by Ignatius Press.
Got a whole case of
Originally by Francis and Herald Press, but Ignatius Press now has the rights. That's the definitive biography. And then Cyprian Davis in his book, The History of Black Catholics, has a chapter to Tolkien.
The other thing I'd like to say is, I know we are reaching out to the African American community, but there's so many of other Catholics who don't know about it, who could also watch and pray. And I was delighted this month in the new publication, Give Us This Day, one of the blessed among us was Augustus.
Now, we've been all over the United States giving requests to spread the story, but I think it's spread best not by so much me, but folks like yourselves. You can take it back to your parishes or your religious education programs, adult education programs, the youth ministry, and so forth, and to tell the story, how it gets around. Yes.
Challenge everyone here. They have petitions during the mass. In my parish in Virginia, I asked for petition prayers for the cause of the canonization of Father Augustus Tolkien at mass every Sunday, and it brings up attention because people come in the after mass and say, "Well, who is he?" It's an opportunity for information. I'm in a formerly predominantly Black Catholic parish that is now predominantly multicultural, and like my sister said over here, it's all Catholics should be aware of who he is and what his cause was. And many people are enlightened. And people who have problems, I give them the prayer card and ask them to pray for them. Because we all need that miracle.
Notwithstanding Andrea de Lille, the founders of the Holy Family Sisters in New Orleans, don't you think it's about time we have an African American saint? We don't have one. We should have a saint, but given the convert component of our community, many blacks who came from other traditions were saints or poo-hoo. The cult of saints is just not recognized at all, thanks to Martin Luther and his friends. But we don't have that train. Every other group has their saints and their martyrs. But we don't. Why is that? We should. You know, I mean, Martin Luther, Martin de Porres is from South America, Leon Marius is from Uganda, East Africa, Josephine Bakita from Sudan. Where's ours?
Father Augustus.
We have holy people amongst us. Yes.
How do we go about getting the holy card involved?
You write my office.
But on your website, it doesn't have a price.
No, we discussed that with you over the phone.
He is something else. She said, how do we do the price? He said, we discussed that
To
on
be
the
honest with
phone.
you, the donations that come
The
from
prayer cards.
these
Give them in
materials
bulk.
must underwrite the costs. You know, translating all these documents into Italian is very expensive. Opening up that grave is going to be an expensive invoice. You know, that comes largely from our donations.
I have one other question. In Chicago, that church does not exist anymore.
Well, they tore it down in 1945.
Right. Is there any plan to have some monument or something there? I mean, there are a couple of Catholic churches right near there, but not.
It's city-owned property. We're in dialogue with the city to see if they will let us put a monument on the City Housing Authority. They tore the church down in 45 to make room for a housing project.
Well, they turn all the other ones down, they tear that one down.
So we're still in conversation. Yes.
Mr. Perry, we, our Black Catholic Advisory Circle in Seattle, Washington, has adopted by the total.
Thank you.
But in addition, I really want to congratulate you on this spread. It is a beautiful spread. It really is, and especially the last paragraph, the first sentence, that complete what you have begun in us, that we might go to the fulfillment of the kingdom. I find it especially powerful, and I use it every day to pray for my children.
Yes, sir.
Did you, in digging into Brother Cole's life, what do they have to do with siblings? Do they have any?
His siblings?
Right.
After Martha Jane escaped from Missouri and came over to Illinois, the oldest boy died, Charles. He was a sickly child, and he contracted pneumonia and never quite recovered. He didn't have the kind of medical attention that he needed. So the oldest boy died. Anne lived on, she died in Chicago in 1911, and her descendants, many of them are still in Chicago. She's buried next to her mother and some other family members in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. So she lived through, and who else was there? Who was there? Augustus. Yeah. It was just the three. Yes.
I'm talking about the church that was built on Grace and Dearborn.
Same Monica.
Yeah, this, that's still has some influence in the building, St. Elizabeth's Church, or First Mission.
No.
I don't know, you didn't have any.
No. Cardinal Mundelein in 1929 merged St. Monica with St. Elizabeth. The Blessed Sacrament sisters were teaching there, and there was no other black priest to run the parish there at St. Monica. And after Tolkien's death, the parish just kind of fizzled. The school went the longest, but then eventually the school was merged with St. Elizabeth's. And the Divine Word Fathers were asked to kind of take the ministry, the black ministry at that time. That was 1929.
At St. Anne's, we had a cultural board, which was African American Christian, on a yearly basis, different tasks that I still doing now. We used to have a cultural board.
Kind of passed into history.
But that's how I found out about this.
Yeah, I'm asking St. Augustine. I've been, we have open society, it's been running for 50 years. I don't think we connected with this group at all. Is there a way that we can network this a little bit?
Sure.
Second thing was recently I had a flyer come from his great-great-grandniece, who was a minister.
Sabrina Penn,
Yeah, I think that was her name.
she defected to the Pentecostals. Yeah, Sabrina is, will be Tolkien's great-great-great-grandniece, descendant of his sister Anne. And she's a ministress in the south suburbs of Chicago. Something happened there in the family that took the family away from the Catholic Church.
Well, we should pray for her to bring her
The
back.
older generation remained Catholic. That would be my generation and the two generations above. They remain Catholic. Some of those folks are dying. Yes.
What miracle happened when he became the servant of God?
There was no miracle. It's just
We need two miracles.
after the Congregation for Causes of Saints does their consultation with the cardinals in Rome. Then they issue the decree serving God. They cannot find anything that would prevent the research from happening because of some reputation or something. But they made that declaration this past February that we could continue investigating. Yes.
Bishop, could we collectively say the prayer since we're here?
Yeah, we do that, yeah.
Bishop, miracles can be manifested in many ways. Why does the church insist on medical miracles?
Because
that's the way it is.
dramatic display of God. The church chooses that extraordinary display, the stamp of approval from God. We have collected so far about 20-some letters that have been written to us of people who have said they've received certain favors through children. People looking for jobs, people having some health matters, family matters, all kinds of things. We gave those to Rome last week just to look at, to see that Toten is being kept busy. And two of them we asked to have their panel of physicians to look at to see if they're worth investigating further as possible miracles. But we have yet to hear from them to see what their determination is. One involves a woman who had an ectopic pregnancy in New Hampshire, and another was a seminarian who collapsed on the gym floor and lost oxygen to the brain. About 20-some minutes, and a group of his classmates prayed to Toten for his recovery, and he turned around. That shouldn't stop you from praying. Because if Rome doesn't accept those, we're going to need some miracle, unless you can arrange one. Someone get up from the dead or something like that. Oh, Lord. That'd be marvelous. Yes.
Bishop, what's your measure of effectiveness of the groundswell? Is it continual? Is it how many people connect with the main office and getting prayer cards or contributions, or how can you measure the effectiveness of the anticipated groundswell that Rome needs to see?
Well, I can only measure it by people who have contacted my office since this began. The story is just getting out into the African American community. It seems like everybody else knows about Toten except us. You know, and that's why we have to. The day that he's proclaimed a saint, there should be more than 20 of us there in Rome to witness it. So that's why the groundswell has to keep coming.
And embracing the cult of, what did you say, the cult of
Toten.
The cult of Toten.
Yes. And that begins with that prayer. You know, everybody prays to saints except us. We've been taught in our history we pray to God alone. That's our Protestant background. You know. But the saints, the line between us and the saints is very thin. Very, very thin. I talk to Toten every day. Every day. Yes.
I just wanted to say, I'm from Boston, Mass., and there's some very religious people in my office, and a very religious white man gave me this book, and I had never heard of him. And I actually didn't believe it. I was embarrassed because I'd never heard of him. So I went on the internet, and it was just a remarkable story. But all these years, I'm like 70 now, and I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it. I never heard of him, sorry.
There are some CDs, the Lighthouse series of CDs, and there's one that they produced that
In my office.
Oh.
An African American woman in the parish where I lived starred as his mother, and an African American priest starred as Toten, and I had a narrative of that.
It was very good. I enjoyed it and passed it on.
Need to use social media.
I'm Deacon Royce Winters, the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Just simply want to say I'm working with the Archdiocese and the seminary. We're creating an educational tool on vocations. And Justice Tolston's story will be a part of that educational tool that will be distributed throughout the junior high, high school, throughout the Archdiocese.
As a seminarian, we always knew of Tolkien because the first 6 or 7 black priests in the country were always known by us, by their names and their pictures. No one ever called him as a singer. No one called any of them as singers. You think of your priests, your pastors as singers?
We do our bishops. One at a time, y'all.
So when you know they're aware of when our children take his name in confirmation. So we teach him in school. We definitely teach him in CCD, but we teach him in school. So our children in that area, and we've been through this process of what it takes to be a saint a couple of times in my Catholic working career. So we know it's extremely expensive, it's extremely tedious, it's draining on the people because we're not trained in this life to wait on anything. And this takes time, it takes money. I work with the language bill, and it takes paper that I couldn't believe how much paper it takes because they change one thing, you got to be submitted the whole thing. So we need to pray for you.
Well, I thank you for your interest, and I rely on you for your prayers and spreading the story of Tolkien. If you would rise, we'll say the Tolkien prayer.
There's a gala fundraiser in October 19th, with the cause of sainthood for Father Augustus Tolkien at the Hyatt Regency, McCormick Place.
What's it? Chicago.
Chicago. It's on the website.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
O God, we give you thanks for your servant and priest, Father Augustus Tolkien, who labored among us in times of contradiction, times that were both beautiful and paradoxical. His ministry helped lay the foundation for a truly Catholic gathering in freedom. We stand in shadow of his ministry. May his life continue to inspire us and endue us with confidence and hope that will forge new evangelization for the church we love. Father in heaven, Father of suffering service, shed light on our sorrows. We see them through the prism of your Son's passion and death. If it be your will, O God, glorify your servant, Father Tolkien, by granting favor I now request through his intercession. So that all may know the goodness of this priest, whose memory looms large in the church you love,